Thank you. So I'm the Grugq, and this talk is sort of one I've been working on for a while now. And you can tell that because this slide of the agenda is completely wrong and out of order. It does at least begin where we begin, and it does end where we began. But in between, we may or may not cover these things. So basically what I'm going to be talking about is systems, right? And how basically hacking can be a purely technical endeavor, but it's actually far more powerful if we think about attacking systems as a whole rather than specific parts of that system. So manipulating an entire system is a more powerful paradigm. And to get into that, we're going to do a bit of a story time. So we start off September 1st, 2022 in Moscow. And Yandex Taxi gets hacked. So Yandex Taxi is basically like Uber or Lyft or Grab or Gojek, where basically you order a taxi with an app and it shows up and it takes you to where you're supposed to go. And let's see if I've got the thing that works. So on this day, for some reason, hundreds of taxis all showed up at the exact same location at the same time. All right? And this is because the Yandex taxi system itself was hacked. So this lasted for several hours. If we keep going, he pulls up his phone and you can see that he's got the order of where to go. And so as we saw, there's basically hundreds of these taxis all showed up at the exact same place, all at the same time, to pick up the same non-existent fare. And it caused a huge traffic problem for a few hours, which I'm not sure if anyone noticed, because Moscow has bad traffic all the time anyway. But, it is what it is. And this was claimed by Anonymous, they took credit for it. There was some discussion, right? So after this hack had happened, there was a lot of discourse about, does this actually count? And basically, no. The consensus was all they did was some sort of technical thing that made the whole system fail to operate correctly. So it's not really a hack, if you think about it. Or you had people going it wasn't hacked. They just added a whole bunch of fake information into the system to make it misbehave. So, it's not really a hack if you think about it. And then there was it's not actually a hack. They just called it denial of service. That's not a hack, really. And I've got a couple of things that I want to sort of bring up here, whereas I think that the fixation on whether this was done via a technical means or not is actually irrelevant, right? Because the thing that got hacked was Yandex Taxi, right? The entire system of Yandex Taxi, which is made up of apps, it's made up of a back end, it's made up of drivers, and it's made up of cars, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff in there beyond just the computers. And that's what got hacked, right? So that was the alchemy that happened. These guys took this really, really shitty primitive, right? They were able to order a taxi to anywhere, right? It's like the lamest possible thing you could do. But they were able to turn that lead into gold by changing the way that they approached it, by looking at the entire system rather than just this one technical element that they controlled, right? So you could take, I can request any taxi to any location, which is kind of lame, and turn it into, I can request every taxi to one location, right? And by doing that, they've turned this really lame primitive into gold, right? They've attacked the entire system. And the reason that this works is that it's a socio-techno system. It's not just the app that's running on the phone or just the back end, right? It's this amalgam of all of these pieces together. And so part of the reason it works is, for example, the drivers get penalized if they have accepted a fare, such as, going to pick someone up. And then if they cancel that fare before they've gone to the location, waited 10 minutes for the person not to show up, and then, left. And so what happened was all of these people had to stay in line knowing that there was no fare, because if they canceled, they would be penalized, right? Like they would incur negative problems for doing the rational thing. They could see that it was broken, but the system would only be able to see that they were, misbehaving, right? And so it's because, it gets sort of into the sensory organs of systems, which we'll get into in a minute. But because the system wasn't designed to be able to understand this sort of weird state of being, this weird play, it wasn't able to respond to it. And this is the case with all systems always, because as soon as you have a complex system, you have a system that fails in complex ways. And it's very, very hard to predict what's going to make it fail, right? Afterwards, it's super easy. Like, you can look at this and be like, well, I mean, obviously, if you've got, hundreds of fares going to one location, there's something wrong. You should clearly cancel them because that's, broken in some way. But beforehand, clearly, that was not a thing that people thought of. And so we sort of get into the ways that systems perceive the world. And the thing is, systems are basically only as good as their sensory organs. Oh, sweet. So as you can all see, no, that's not on my end. That's yeah. There's a complex system failing in a complex way. So anyway, imagine a slide with a dude dressed as a robot, and then there's some text right over here, and it says socio-techno system, and then it's got some points that say drivers are penalized, and it's got checks and all this stuff. It looks pretty cool. And now there's a guy in a pool getting hit in the face with a ball, and it says system sensory organs underneath. And it's fucking great. I mean, it's really funny. Highly recommended. Yeah, if you guys could see it, you would be blown away. Honestly. Okay, and so, this is great. I mean, how could I even describe it? This is... So yeah, let's see. I'm gonna do something complicated. Yeah. No, that's definitely not my fault. Okay, so now we've got a lion cub jumping into a tree and missing. And so, again, it's absolutely hilarious. I highly recommend. If you guys all come around here, there's a screen, actually, that shows it. Oh, this is great. Okay, so fortunately, this is not a presentation made up entirely of funny pictures, videos, and important things to look at. It's mostly just a paper I could read. Okay. So, speaking of sensory organs, next up is... So this is it's a sequence of photos of the same guy doing a facial recognition. Basically, he had a facial recognition software that was going to tell him, whether it's a male or female and the age range. And basically, by adjusting his hair, he gets from female of 35 to 45, and he puts his hair back and it's boy 8 to 12, and he turns to one side, and it's an older female, and he puts his hair back, and it's a younger male. So basically, the point here is that systems have sensory organs, and those sensory organs are basically, as I said, the system is only as good as the sensory organs, and the problem with these sensory organs is they're not very good. Right? They tend to fail in weird ways. And because the input that the system gets from that is how it's going to respond to the world, if that input is wrong, then it's going to misbehave. Which leads us to sort of one of the first important rules, which is that if the system didn't see it, it didn't happen. Right? So if you do things that are not captured by the system, they don't exist. Right? And the corollary, of course, is that if the system did see it, it happened. Right? So regardless of which way it goes, the only thing that the system knows about is what it can get as input. And then, this is pretty bad. All right. Again, this is an awesome slide. It's got like owls and like, I mean, there's like...
Testing. Hi, yeah. Grugq. Sorry, ladies, gentlemen. And Grugq, we're sorting out some technical, clearly, we're sorting out some technical issues at the back. So,
hey. Yay. All right. So, I am not at all completely thrown off my stride, and I'll just pick up exactly where I was. Okay, so as I was saying, like basically, this is because the Yandex taxi system, like the entire system, was hacked. And these larger systems are the things that are always going to be vulnerable as we go forward. And that's why, like, regardless of what gets done for security, as long as there are complex systems, which there have to be, they will be vulnerable to being attacked. And as I was saying, you know, systems are only as good as their sensory organs. And the thing about, like, sensory organs is it's like everything that the system knows about the world. And as I was saying, they can be fallible. So, for example, here you have a guy who is looking on normally, and he's, you know, a female. Turns his head to his side, and now he's a female who is 20 years older. Looks back the other way, and now he's a male. And if he puts his hair back, he's an 8-year-old. So, right, we do have, like, all of these systems, and they do complex things, but they also fail in weird and complex ways. And that's basically the beauty of the whole thing. So, as I was saying, everyone can see that, right? Yeah. So, if the system didn't see it, it didn't happen. Oh, shit. Right? And the corollary being that if the system saw it, it did happen. And this is important because basically systems only understand their inputs, right? So I actually don't know why the slide is here because I don't have a follow-up. But speaking about systems exploitation, the thing is that, like, the important variables are found out by accident. So as we saw with the Yandex taxi, right, the important variable is actually, if you have hundreds of taxis going to pick up the same fare, something is wrong, right? So retrospectively, you can figure that out pretty easily, right? Like, it's blindingly obvious. But beforehand, that's not something that you think about. And we can see this show up loads and loads of times when we look at, like, the last... There's been several lunar landers that failed in spectacular ways for dumb reasons. So there was an Israeli one where there was a glitch in the computer. So it was during the descent phase, it was firing its thrusters, it was coming down. There was a glitch. In order to reset the glitch, they rebooted the computer. While the computer was rebooting, the thrusters stopped firing because it was rebooting. And then when it came back up, it was traveling too fast and it smashed into the moon. So it turns out that, you know, you need your thrusters to fire when the system is rebooting. Lesson learned. India had a lander where, as it was coming down, it got buffeted by, like, the forces were outside the parameters it was spec'd for, so it ignored them, right? Like, it could only measure so much, like, stress, and because it was outside that range, it was like, well, nothing's happening. It ended up being upside down, which it wasn't aware of because it hadn't monitored any of these inputs. As it was then trying to figure out how far it was from the surface, it didn't correct for the fact it was upside down. So it discovered it was 12 kilometers below the surface. And, yeah, smacked in. And then we have there's another one where the Japanese had a system. And what happened was it wasn't going to be fooled by, like, finding out it was 12 kilometers below the surface, right? So it's flying across, and it crosses the lip of a crater. So it suddenly goes from being 2 kilometers in the air to being 5 kilometers in the air, which, as far as this thing is concerned, means that the radar is malfunctioning, because there's no way that they just shot up 3 kilometers. So it stops paying attention to radar, because the radar is malfunctioning, and it just goes on dead reckoning, which ends up with the thing hovering several kilometers above the surface until it runs out of gas, right? And in each of these scenarios, like, I don't build rockets and I don't know how lunar landing works, but I can explain what went wrong. And that's because it's very easy to figure it out afterwards. Like, retrospectively, it's simple to go like, oh yeah, well, obviously you wouldn't want to do that. You got to check out for craters. I mean, who wouldn't, right? It's similarly with like the Boeing Max 737, right? Or the 737 Max, where like, they didn't have 2 inputs, they only had 1. And so, like, it could get confused and force the plane to crash. Like, none of us designs airplanes, but we all know what went wrong. And that's because it's usually very, very simple afterwards, right? And that's kind of the beauty of it. But obviously, it's a little bit harder to make predictions about the future. And sort of more importantly with that is that, so as we've been talking about, like, these complex systems that fail in weird and complex ways for reasons that are obvious in retrospect, the other thing is that everything is systems. Like, it's all systems. So there's always going to be things that you can break. And now, sort of thinking about systems, one of the really, really cool things, I think, is about like trying to understand the physics of cyberspace and how, like, it actually works. And one of the things here is that it's all controlled by private companies, right? From the physical infrastructure to the cloud, you know, to data, like the data centers, all the computers, all of this stuff. It's all actually owned by private entities. And, like, these private entities control the physics of that space, right? And they do it with corporate policies, right? Like, they're not actually, like, they're not public utilities. No one voted for them. We don't really have any control over them. They do what they want to do, what they think is going to be, like, best for shareholder value. And like, this results in very, very interesting things, right? So, for example, Russian state disinformation had to adapt to Facebook's policies, right? After 2016, Facebook changed the way that they allow people to operate on their platform, and that caused an entire intelligence infrastructure to shift the way that it operates, right? Like, that's hugely powerful if you think about it, right? There's not a lot of companies out there that can, like, make a policy decision that alters the way that a state's entire intelligence apparatus has to function, right? And they can do that at any point that they like. They can change it at any time. And so, similarly, there was, like, right on the 24th of last year, the Ukrainian telcos severed all of their connections between themselves and Russia, right? So a whole bunch of stuff that had been operating based on the assumption that you could send messages easily between the Ukraine and Russia stopped functioning, right? They literally altered the landscape that people were operating on in a few hours. They simply decided, okay, we're going to terminate all of our connections. And this caused huge disruptions for the invading forces. Some of the stuff that they did led to, so for example, they weren't able to use their own telco infrastructure. They had to switch to using Ukrainian infrastructure, which meant that it could be monitored locally, which obviously caused problems. So all of this stuff was done just as policy, right? Like, the actual physics of the whole space was controlled by these decisions. So, like, the physics of cyber is determined by shareholder value, right? Like, these systems are controlled entirely by, like, the whims of a few people on boards. And why I think this is relevant is there's a quote from Brian Snow, who was the head of information insurance at NSA, which was, so he says, like, basically your cyber systems continue to serve you, not due to the expertise of your security staff, but solely due to the sufferance of your opponents. And I would turn that back around on him and say that, like, your cyber espionage continues to serve you, not due to the expertise of your intelligence staff, but solely due to the sufferance of, like, Meta and Amazon and Apple and so on. So a way to think about this would be, if Google decided to shut down all Netherlands cyber operations, they could do it, right? They have enough visibility and they have enough control and they have a big enough platform that they could detect, 80% of everything. They could post it publicly and they could, shut it down. But the reason they do that, the reason that they don't do that, isn't because it's technically not feasible. It's because it would be a bad political decision. But, right, it would be a bad political decision because if they did it, then the Netherlands could apply pressure and so on. But which country is the last country that has enough clout to do that? Right? Could, like, South Sudan do the same thing? Or Chad? Burma? At some point, these private companies have more power than states. And I think that's very interesting. So, back to robot taxis, which is basically where we started off, where there are taxis that were being operated basically by robots because they were forced to do what the policies told them to do. And now we're going to be talking about autonomous vehicles, where they are literally doing what they are programmed to do. And the thing I find sort of most interesting about this is that we're taking systems, and, like, systems fail. Systems are terrible. And we're putting them in human spaces. And, like, humans are very messy and weird. And, like, these things are not designed to handle that. So, let's see. Here, for example, we've got a Tesla that is being assaulted by traffic lights. And that's because it's driving behind a truck. Right? And here there's a food delivery robot that doesn't know what crime scene tape means. So it simply drives across. Right? And that's because when it was designed to go across, it was going to go across, like, the pedestrian crossing, but it doesn't know anything at all about the way that, like, the cops work. Right? And if we look at the way that the cops work, here we have an autonomous vehicle that got pulled over. The cop shows up to, like, figure out what the fuck's going on. The car goes, all right, well. And so that's basically the thing with robotaxis, is that, like, as systems, right, like, these are systems operating with multi-ton vehicles in human spaces based on a set of rules that make sense in, like, theory, but don't really in practice. And so we see, like, robotaxis do these really weird things, right? So they don't recognize emergency tape, so they run right across it. They don't recognize things like downed power lines, so they'll run right through them. They don't really understand that a firehouse is different from, like, a regular house. So if they stop in front of one and trucks can't get out, then, like, so be it. They randomly fail. Like, they will be driving down streets and then they just stop for unknown reasons and will stay there for hours. And, like, emergency vehicles come up behind them, and, like, I have pictures which I haven't included here, but there's, like, a particular right turn in Austin which for some reason causes all of these, like, autonomous vehicles to stop. And so there's, like, a picture of a guy going, like, I'm just going out to the store, and, like, I saw this, and there's a picture of, like, 2 cars parked in the street. And then an hour later, he's like, the cars are gone and now there's a new one. And it's a different one parked in a slightly different area. And then the next day, there's another two. Like, consistently, they all just break down in the same area. They get freaked out. Right? Or, here. And these are complaints that have been, like, raised by the city against, like, allowing these things to drive around. And, one of them drove up behind a fire truck and parked on the fire hose. Like, these things are fucked up. And so, people, just like these systems behave really weirdly around humans, humans behave in weird ways around them as well. So one of the things that's been pointed out is robo-taxis have basically become these roaming, like they're basically short-time hotels. Like there's a huge amount of sex that happens in them because, like, as you do. Similarly, right, people who are not driving because they're too drunk tend to also be people who like projectile vomit in cars, right? And now, if it's your personal Uber and you're driving someone, you can look, right? So they'll basically, the driver will say, like, how are you doing this evening? To self, the guy's like, I'm doing fucking fine, right? And then you can go, yeah, okay, like, here's a plastic bag, right? But robo-taxis don't have that. So you basically just get in and puke all you like, and it'll drop you off at home. But the other thing is that if you put a cone on the hood of a car, it stops, right? And it has to stay there until someone comes and takes it off. And so that's what people are doing. They call it coning. And like, basically, yeah, like in order to deal with these things, they just stop them wherever they are and like leave them. And again, it's because complex systems fail in complex ways, right? Like as a human driver, if someone puts a cone on the hood of your car, you're probably going to get out and yell at them, take it off, and drive on, right? But that's not a thing that autonomous vehicles can do. And so these sorts of like weird things are going to keep coming up because there's going to be more and more weird systems. And that is because reality is more complex than it seems. So when you start out and you start going like, okay, well, how hard can it be to program a car, right? I mean, you follow the fucking road, you don't run into people, you stop. It's pretty straightforward, right? There's a set of rules to follow. It's pretty easy. And it turns out that like, it's actually not, right? Because no matter how close you get, there's always like a huge leap that you still have to do. And you can cover that. And then there's still like, someone puts a cone on the hood of the car, right? You can get incrementally closer, but never quite there. And this comes from a paper where they were discussing computer graphics in like the early 80s. And basically, they were trying to create like a CGI model of a coffee cup. And it seems like super easy, like a coffee cup. Like it's a cylinder, it's closed at one end, and it's got a handle. But, I mean, it's actually not, right? Because it's got like dimension, and it's got a curved lip. And like the handle doesn't join seamlessly. It's got like a little bit of clay around it. And then the bottom isn't actually completely flat, and like on and on and on. And no matter how close you get, there's always like some more that you have to do. And it's because reality is more complex than it seems. And now, the other thing to think about is that systems do not adapt to people, right? Once a system has been put in place, that's what you get, right? That's the system. And you're going to have to figure out how to work with it. I mean, and there's other things, right? So it's a lot easier to put a system up than it is to take it down. And things like the old system is the new problem. But, here you go. Like, you've got a system. You want a bouncy castle? We've got a bouncy castle. It's got a slide. It's great. I mean, it's not really going to fit in the space you want, but, you can turn it to the side, you can kind of jig it in there, and like, it sort of works, basically. But, ideally that's not what you would want, but that's what you get. And so we sort of have this thing of like, we do not adapt systems to us, we adapt to systems. And so I'll leave you with a final anecdote, which is, in LA, they've got these food delivery trucks, like these little food delivery carts. And for some reason, part of a major thoroughfare is now deemed to be a crossing space for these things. So people will be driving their cars, and suddenly this robot will just shoot out in front of them and cross the street. And I put it to you that there's basically two ways that this could be solved. One of them would be that you find the company and you get them to fix their software so it doesn't just shoot out randomly into the street. And the other way is you put up a sign that says, slow, robot crossing. Okay. So that's basically it. Are there any questions? I mean, obviously not. I think I've covered everything thoroughly. So. No? Really? Okay.
Okay.
Well,
thank you very much for that fantastic
cool. Thank you.
and hilarious,
Thank you.